He thought he knew every secret within the stone walls of his fortress. But when Alpha King Alistair descended into the servants' kitchens long past midnight, the scent of salt, blood, and muffled weeping stopped him dead in his tracks. There, huddled beside the dying embers of the hearth, was Clara, his loyal Beta's daughter. She was shivering, her coarse linen tunic pushed down her shoulders, revealing a back mutilated by jagged silver burn scars. As he stepped out of the shadows, the terrified gasp she let out shattered the quiet night. The truth behind those wounds was about to destroy his entire kingdom. The fortress of Highridge sat like a jagged crown atop the frostbitten peaks of the Northern Territories. For centuries, it had been the seat of the most ruthless werewolf lineage in the known lands. To the outside world, it was an impenetrable bastion of strength and unity. But from within, it was a festering wound of politics, betrayal, and buried sins. Clara Hastings knew this better than anyone. She was the daughter of Frederick Hastings, the Alpha King's right hand, the esteemed Beta whose tactical brilliance had won a dozen border wars. By all rights of birth and blood, Clara should have been draped in heavy furs, dining at the high table, and entertaining suitors from allied packs. Instead, she knelt on the freezing flagstones of the scullery, her raw hands scrubbing the grease from massive iron cauldrons with a brush made of stiff boar bristles. The kitchens were her sanctuary and her prison. 3 years ago, after the devastating ambush at the Whispering Pines, Clara had returned changed. The pack was told she had been mauled by rogues, her wolf spirit shattered by the trauma rendering her unable to shift. In the brutal hierarchy of the Highridge pack, a wolf who could not shift was a liability. A Beta's daughter who was broken was a political embarrassment. Her father, prioritizing his standing with the newly crowned Alpha King over his own flesh and blood, had quietly shuffled her away into the depths of the castle. Out of sight, out of mind. Clara plunged her hands back into the bucket of freezing light-clouded water. The harsh soap stung countless micro-cuts on her knuckles, but the physical pain was a welcome distraction from the agonizing deep tissue burn that radiated across her back and shoulders. It was the dead of winter, yet her skin felt as though it was pressed against hot coals. "You're scrubbing too hard, girl. You'll take the iron right off the pot," muttered Maud, the head cook, a heavy-set woman who was one of the few souls in the fortress who treated Clara with a gruff sort of kindness. Maud wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and looked at Clara with a mixture of pity and frustration. "The feast is over. The nobles are drunk on mulled wine and sleeping it off. Go to your cot. There are still 3 platters left, Maud," Clara replied, her voice soft, carrying a raspy edge from disuse. "If I leave them, the grease will congeal by dawn. Lord Stirling's steward will have my head." "Let him try. I run this kitchen, not some powdered steward," Maud huffed. She walked over and gently touched Clara's shoulder. Clara flinched violently, a sharp intake of breath hissing through her teeth as Maud's hand grazed her collarbone. Maud immediately pulled back, her eyes narrowing. "It's the cold, isn't it? Making your old wounds ache?" "Yes," Clara lied smoothly, keeping her gaze fixed on the dirty water. "Just the cold. I'll finish up here and go straight to bed. I promise." Maud hesitated, but the exhaustion of cooking a 10-course feast for 50 visiting Alpha delegates won out. "Don't stay up too late, Clara. Tomorrow is the king's naming day." "It will be twice as bad." As Maud's heavy footsteps echoed away down the stone corridor, Clara was finally left alone. The massive kitchen, with its 3 giant hearths and vaulted ceilings, felt cavernous and echoing. Only one hearth still held a flickering fire, casting long, dancing shadows against the soot-stained walls. Clara waited until she was absolutely sure she was alone. The silence of the castle was heavy, broken only by the howling of the mountain wind outside the narrow, iron-barred windows. She slowly stood up, her knees popping in protest. She walked toward the dying fire, her breath visible in the frigid air. The pain was becoming unbearable. It was the silver. Werewolves healed from almost anything, but silver left permanent, agonizing traces. It poisoned the blood, burned the nerve endings, and rejected the body's natural regenerative magic. The wounds she bore were not from rogue claws, as her father had told the pack. Rogues did not wield delicate filigree daggers, nor did they heat iron brands in the shape of the royal crest. Clara reached a trembling hand to the collar of her coarse wool tunic. The rough fabric was rubbing against the inflamed flesh of her shoulders, making her nauseous. She needed to apply the salve, a meager concoction of crushed wintermint and yarrow she had smuggled from the apothecary's garden. It wouldn't cure the silver poisoning, but it would numb the fire enough to let her sleep. With agonizing slowness, she untied the leather laces at her throat. High above the kitchens, in the royal wing of the fortress, Alpha King Alistair was awake. He stood on the balcony of his chambers, oblivious to the biting blizzard that whipped against his bare chest. Alistair was a towering figure, built like a siege engine, with dark hair swept back from a face that was more sharp angles and battle-worn exhaustion than aristocratic grace. He had taken the throne 3 years ago during a time of bloody upheaval, and the crown rested heavily on his brow. He was suffocating. The feast tonight had been a parade of sycophants and ambitious lords, all thrusting their daughters in his direction, eager to secure the position of Luna. Rowena, the daughter of the Western Alpha, had been the most aggressive, her cloying perfume still lingering in Alistair's nose. He despised the politics. He despised the smiling faces that hid sharpened daggers. His wolf, the massive, dominant beast that dwelled within his soul, was restless. It paced relentlessly in his mind, clawing at his sanity. Lies, his wolf growled. Everything smells of lies. Unable to stand the gilded cage of his chambers for another second, Alistair grabbed a heavy, fur-lined cloak and threw it over his shoulders. He needed space. He needed the raw, unpolished stone of the fortress depths, where the air didn't smell of perfume and roasted pheasant. He left his guards behind with a sharp command and began to descend the winding, torchlit staircases. He had no destination in mind. He just let his instincts guide his boots, his heightened senses mapping the quiet fortress. He passed the armory, the lower guard barracks, and eventually found himself near the servant corridors. As he neared the kitchens, his acute hearing picked up a sound that made his wolf suddenly stop its internal pacing and snap to attention. It was a whimper, raw, choked, and heavy with an unspeakable amount of pain. Alistair froze. He tasted the air. Beneath the overwhelming scent of old wood smoke, dried herbs, and lye soap, there was something metallic and sharp. Blood, old blood, and the foul, unmistakable tang of silver infection. His brow furrowed. Silver was strictly monitored in Hyrage. No servant had access to it, and no guard would draw it within the walls without his express order. Silently, his bare feet making no sound on the freezing stone, the Alpha King pushed open the heavy oak door leading to the main kitchen. The sight that greeted him made the breath stall in his chest. By the dim, orange glow of the dying embers, a small figure sat on a wooden stool, her back to the door. It was Clara. Alistair recognized her instantly, though he had not truly looked at her in years. He knew her as Frederick's tragic daughter, the girl who had survived the rogue attack but lost her wolf. He had briefly mourned her fate when he first took the throne, but his duties had quickly swept her from his mind, assuming she was living comfortably in the upper estates, recovering in peace. He had no idea she was down here, dressed in the rags of a scullery maid. But that was not what made his blood run cold. Clara had pushed her heavy wool tunic down to her waist, exposing her bare back to the warmth of the fire. Alistair's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror. Her back was a tapestry of mutilation. Deep, jagged ravines of scar tissue crisscrossed her pale skin, shining with a sickly, iridescent sheen in the firelight, the telltale sign of silver burns. Some scars were old, thick, and raised, while others looked dangerously inflamed, angry red lines tracking up her spine and wrapping around her delicate ribs. In the center of her shoulder blades, burned deep into the muscle, was a symbol. Alistair stepped closer, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. His wolf was roaring in his head, a deafening sound of protective rage and profound shock. The symbol burned into her flesh was not a random rogue marking. It was a crest, a stylized wolf head crowned with thorns. It was the personal sigil of Lady Rowena's house. Clara, completely unaware of the apex predator standing just 20 ft behind her, let out another ragged sob. Her slender frame shook violently as she reached around with trembling fingers, trying to smear a green, foul-smelling paste onto the worst of the burns. She couldn't reach the center of her back. She tried, contorting her arm, but the movement pulled at the tight scar tissue. She dropped the small wooden tin of salve, burying her face in her hands. The sound of her weeping in the desolate kitchen was the most heartbreaking thing Alistair had ever heard. It wasn't loud. It was the quiet, suppressed crying of someone who had learned the hard way that screaming brought nothing but more pain. Alistair's mind raced, connecting the fragmented pieces of a horrifying puzzle. 3 years ago, the ambush at Whispering Pines. That was the same month Lady Rowena had first arrived at Hyrage to begin marriage negotiations with Alistair's late father. Clara had been a vibrant, beautiful girl then, the jewel of the pack, a potential candidate for Luna herself. And then, the rogue attack. Frederick had handled the investigation. Frederick had declared her wolf dead. Frederick had sent her down here, his beta. Rage, absolute and terrifying, ignited in Alistair's chest. The air in the kitchen suddenly grew heavy, the atmospheric pressure dropping as the Alpha's aura bled into the room, thick and suffocating. Clara gasped, her heightened senses, the senses of a wolf supposedly dead, picking up the sudden shift in the air. She spun around on the stool, clutching her tunic to her chest, her eyes wide with animalistic terror. When she saw the towering silhouette of the Alpha King standing in the gloom, his eyes glowing a dangerous, luminescent amber, she scrambled backward. The stool clattered to the stone floor. She hit the edge of the large wooden prep table, trapping herself. My king, she stammered, her voice cracking. She tried desperately to pull the tunic up over her shoulders, wincing in agony as the rough fabric scraped the inflamed silver burns. I beg your pardon. I was cleaning. I am sorry. I will leave. Stop, Alistair commanded. His voice was low, barely a whisper, yet it reverberated off the stone walls with the force of a thunderclap. Clara froze, trembling violently. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, terrified to look at him. She expected punishment. She expected him to drag her out for defiling the kitchens with her exposed wounds. Instead, Alistair closed the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps. He didn't look angry at her, he looked devastated. Who did this to you? He asked, stopping just an arm's length away. Rogues, my king, Clara whispered, reciting the lie she had been forced to tell for 3 agonizing years. At the Whispering Pines, you know the reports. Rogues, Alistair repeated, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. He reached out. Clara flinched back, pressing herself against the table, a terrified whimper escaping her lips. Alistair froze, his hand hovering in the air. The realization that she feared him, that she expected him to hurt her, was a physical blow to his chest. He slowly lowered his hand and took a half step back, giving her space. Rogues do not brand their victims with the sigil of House Thorn, Alistair said softly, his amber eyes locking onto hers. Clara's breath hitched. Her heart hammered so hard, Alistair could hear it echoing in the quiet room. I don't know what you mean, sire. Drop the tunic, Clara. Please, my king, do not make me. That is not a request from your king, Alistair interrupted, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. Guilt, fury, sorrow. It is a plea for me. Drop the tunic. Tears spilled over Clara's pale cheeks. Her fingers shook so badly, she could barely release her grip on the fabric. Slowly, agonizingly, she let the wolf fall back to her waist, bowing her head in shame as her mutilated flesh was laid bare under the alpha's gaze. Alistair stepped to the side, getting a full view of her back in the flickering firelight. Up close, the damage was infinitely worse. He could see the places where the silver had eaten deep into the muscle, healing poorly because she clearly hadn't been given the proper neutralizing antivenoms. She had been left to rot. He noticed the small tin of homemade salve spilled on the floor. Without a word, he knelt, his heavy cloak pooling around him on the dirty stone, and picked it up. He smelled it. Yarrow and mint, barely enough to soothe a bee sting, let alone silver burns. My father handled the investigation of your attack, Alistair said, his voice terrifyingly calm. It was the calm of the eye of a hurricane. Your father, Frederick, brought you back. He said your wolf was killed by a rogue alpha's bite to the spine. He said you were crippled in mind and spirit. Clara kept her eyes on the floor, fresh tears hitting the stone. Yes, lie to me again, Clara, and I will rip this castle apart stone by stone to find the truth myself, Alistair warned gently. He stepped behind her. Clara tensed, expecting a blow. Instead, she felt the cool, thick texture of the salve being applied to the burning brand between her shoulder blades. Alistair's touch was incredibly light, his large, calloused fingers moving with a startling gentleness. A jolt of electricity shot through her spine at the contact. Her wolf, the spirit everyone claimed was dead, stirred weakly in the dark recesses of her mind, letting out a small, yearning croon at the touch of the alpha. Rowena, Alistair stated as he worked the salve into her skin. It wasn't a question. Clara bit her lip until she tasted copper. She was afraid. Afraid of what? Alistair demanded softly. Afraid of me, Clara whispered, the truth finally spilling from her lips after years of suffocating silence. The warmth of his touch, the sheer, overwhelming presence of him, broke the dam she had built around her trauma. Before the ambush, your father had favored me. He told my father that I would make a strong Luna for you when you came of age. Lady Rowena's house heard of this. They had more gold, more soldiers. They needed the alliance with Hyrage. Alistair's hand stilled on her back. Go on. It wasn't a rogue ambush, Clara cried quietly, the memories flooding back. The smell of burning pine, the sound of silver chains. It was Rowena's private guard. They captured me in the woods. They held me for 3 days. They used silver whips, silver blades, to ensure I could never shift again, to ensure I would be permanently scarred, broken, so that no alpha would ever want to mate with me. Alistair's breathing turned ragged. The beast inside him was violently throwing itself against the cage of his ribs, demanding blood, demanding Rowena's head on a spike. And your father, Alistair growled, the vibration of his chest rumbling against Clara's back. Frederick knew of this. Clara let out a bitter, broken laugh. Who do you think found me in the woods, my king? When Rowena's men were done, they left me tied to a tree. My father found me. I begged him for justice. I begged him to tell your father. She closed her eyes. But Rowena's father had offered him vast tracts of land in the eastern valleys to keep his mouth shut. My father told me I was ruined anyway, that a broken daughter was useless to him, but the land would secure our family's future. Alistair felt physically sick. Frederick, the man who had trained him with a sword, the man who sat his right hand in the council chamber, dispensing advice on honor and loyalty. So he declared my wolf dead, Clara finished, her voice hollowing out. He told the pack I was insane from rogue bites. He stripped me of my titles and sent me to the scullery. Rowena got her clear path to you. My father got his lands and I got the dark. The silence in the kitchen was absolute, save for the crackling of the dying fire. Alistair finished applying the salve. He didn't step away. Instead, he unclasped the heavy fur-lined cloak from his own shoulders and draped it carefully around Clara, hiding the scars, enveloping her in his scent, cedar, ozone, and pure, dominant alpha power. Clara gasped at the sudden warmth. She gripped the edges of the cloak, pulling it tight around herself, finally turning to look up at him. Alistair's face was a mask of cold, lethal calculation, but his amber eyes were burning with a terrifying devotion. He reached out, his knuckles brushing a stray lock of hair from her tear-stained cheek. Your wolf is not dead, Clara. Alistair whispered fiercely, feeling the faint, suppressed hum of her spirit reaching out to his. She is just in hiding, and she is going to watch me burn their entire world to the ground. Alistair, you can't. Clara panicked, forgetting all formalities, grabbing his wrist. Rowena's family commands the Western armies. My father controls half your guard. If you move against them without proof, it will mean civil war. They will destroy you. Let them try, Alistair said, a cruel, predatory smile curving his lips. He slipped his hand down to intertwine his fingers with hers, pulling her gently away from the cold stone table. You have hidden in the dark for far too long, Clara Hastings. Tomorrow is my naming day, and I think it is time the Alpha King finally chooses his Luna. The journey from the freezing depths of the scullery to the royal wing was a blur of shadows and hushed breaths. Clara kept her face hidden beneath the heavy fur collar of Alistair's cloak, her bare feet silent on the stone steps. Every shadow seemed to stretch into the shape of her father. Every draft of wind sounded like the metallic clink of Rowena's guards. But ahead of her, leading the way with an impenetrable aura of dominance, was the Alpha King. Alistair deliberately avoided the main corridors, navigating the servant passages and hidden stairwells he had explored as a rebellious pup. He could hear Clara's erratic heartbeat behind him, fluttering like a trapped bird. He projected as much calm and protective energy as he could muster, letting his pine and ozone scent drift back to wrap around her. When he finally pushed open the heavy oak doors to his private chambers, Clara hesitated at the threshold. The royal suite was cavernous, bathed in the warm, golden glow of a roaring fireplace. Tapestries of deep crimson and gold lined the walls, and a massive four-poster bed draped in velvet dominated the center of the room. It was a world of unimaginable luxury, a world she had been violently cast out from 3 years ago. I cannot go in there, Clara whispered, her voice trembling. She looked down at her soot-stained feet and the hem of her ragged tunic peeking out from the cloak. I will ruin the rugs. I am dirty, sire. Alistair turned, his expression softening into something that made Clara's breath hitch. You are not dirty, Clara. You are wounded, and this room is yours as much as it is mine. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder, mindful of the scars, and guided her inside, locking the heavy iron bolt behind them. Sit by the fire, he instructed, pointing to a plush velvet armchair. I must send for someone. I cannot treat these burns properly myself, and if they are left as they are, the silver will eventually reach your heart. Panic flared in her eyes. No, if anyone sees me, if my father finds out the man I am summoning is bound to me by a blood oath, not to your father, and certainly not to Rowena's family, Alistair said firmly. He walked to his mahogany writing desk, penned a swift note, and slipped it out through a small communication chute built into the wall. Dr. Henry Cavendish. He is an outsider, a human alchemist I brought in from the Southern Territories. He has no stake in our pack politics, but his knowledge of metallurgy and blood toxins is unparalleled. He treated the Vanderbilt pack when they were poisoned with mercury. He will keep his silence. 10 minutes later, a sharp, rhythmic knock sounded at the door. Alistair opened it just enough to let a tall, fiercely intelligent-looking man slip inside. Dr. Cavendish wore a tailored wool coat and carried a heavy leather medical bag. His keen gray eyes swept the room, immediately landing on the small figure huddled by the fire. My king, Cavendish murmured, bowing slightly. A late hour for a consultation. I need your absolute discretion, Henry, Alistair said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. What you see in this room does not leave it. If a whisper of this reaches the council, I will have your head. Am I understood? Cavendish didn't flinch. I am a man of science, sire, not a gossip. What is the ailment? Alistair gestured to Clara. He walked over to her, kneeling by the chair. Clara let him see. Trembling, Clara allowed Alistair to pull the heavy cloak from her shoulders. She turned her back to the firelight, exposing the ruined landscape of her skin to the physician. Cavendish inhaled sharply, dropping his bag to the floor with a heavy thud. He quickly approached, pulling a small magnifying monocle from his vest pocket. He leaned in, examining the jagged ravines and the angry, inflamed brand of the Western house. Good God, Cavendish whispered, horrifyingly transfixed. He looked up at Alistair. This is not standard silver weaponry. This is an alloy. I've seen this chemical burn pattern before in the private records of the Astor Syndicate during the border skirmishes. What does that mean? Alistair demanded, his fists clenching at his sides. It means it is laced with a concentrated extract of wolfsbane and white phosphorus, Cavendish explained grimly, opening his bag and pulling out glass vials of clear liquids. It is designed to cause maximum agony, but more insidiously, the wolfsbane acts as a localized paralytic. It binds to the nerve endings in the spine. No wonder she cannot shift. Her wolf isn't dead, sire. It is trapped in a chemically induced coma, suppressed by constant low-grade poisoning. Clara gasped, a sob tearing from her throat. She wasn't broken. She had been poisoned. 3 years of believing she was a defective, half-souled creature, all because of a chemical collar locked into her very flesh. Can you remove it? Alistair asked, his eyes flashing brilliant amber. I can neutralize the active toxins and draw out the residual silver, Cavendish said, rolling up his sleeves, but it will be excruciating. The neutralizer must be scrubbed directly into the scar tissue to break down the heavy metals, and even then it will take days for her wolf to fully wake. Do it, Clara said. Her voice surprised both men. It was no longer the weak, terrified whisper of a scullery maid. It was a raspy, hardened sound. She gripped the wooden arms of the chair until her knuckles turned white. Get it out of me. Cavendish nodded. He poured a glowing blue liquid onto a pristine white cloth. Hold her, sire. She will try to thrash. Alistair moved to the front of the chair. He didn't just hold her, he enveloped her. He wrapped his massive arms around her front, pressing her face into his chest, burying his nose in her hair to flood her senses with his scent. I have you, he murmured against her temple. I have you, Clara. When the chemically soaked cloth touched her open scars, Clara screamed. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, muffled only by Alistair's chest. The blue liquid reacted violently with the embedded silver, hissing and smoking as it pulled the dark, poisoned blood to the surface. Clara's body convulsed violently, her nails digging into Alistair's forearms hard enough to draw blood, but the Alpha King did not budge. He absorbed her pain, sending waves of calming, dominant energy through their physical contact. As the minutes dragged on into hours, a strange phenomenon began to occur. Amidst the sharp, burning scent of chemicals and blood, a new scent began to bloom in the room. It was faint at first, like the first drop of rain on dry earth, but it grew rapidly. Rainwater, crushed orchids, and deep forest moss. It was Clara's scent, her true scent, unmasked by the grime of the kitchens and the foulness of the poison. Alistair's wolf howled in his mind, a sound of absolute, possessive triumph. The golden thread of a mate bond, buried under years of deception and trauma, suddenly snapped taut between them. The shock of it made Alistair gasp. She wasn't just a political pawn. She wasn't just his beta's daughter. She was his fated mate. Clara felt it too. The agonizing pain in her back suddenly dulled, replaced by a rush of golden heat that radiated from where Alistair touched her. She went limp against him, panting heavily, her eyes wide as she looked up into his face. The recognition in his glowing amber eyes mirrored her own. Done, Cavendish announced, wiping his brow with a bloody rag. He looked exhausted. The active poison is neutralized. I have applied a regenerative salve. She will need to rest and she will be weak, but the infection is gone. Alistair didn't look at the doctor. His eyes were locked on Clara. Thank you, Henry. Leave the extra salves and go. Once the heavy door clicked shut, Alistair carefully scooped Clara up into his arms, carrying her to the massive velvet bed. He laid her gently on her stomach, pulling a silk sheet up to her waist. You are my mate, Clara whispered, the reality of the situation crashing down on her. The Alpha King, the man she was supposed to marry before her life was stolen. I am, Alistair said, sitting on the edge of the mattress, his hand gently stroking her hair. And they tried to take you from me. They tortured my mate, threw her in the dirt, and dared to sit at my table and drink my wine. His voice grew deadly quiet, a terrifying promise of violence. Rest now, my Luna, because tomorrow Highridge will drown in their blood. The morning of the king's naming day dawned crisp and blindingly clear. The snow-capped peaks of Highridge glittering like drawn swords against the pale blue sky. The fortress was a hive of frantic activity. Servants rushed through the halls carrying massive platters of roasted meats. Musicians tuned their instruments in the great hall, and the banners of a dozen allied packs snapped in the bitter northern wind. In the high council chamber, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense, masked by thin veils of aristocratic courtesy. Alistair sat at the head of the massive obsidian table, a chalice of spiced wine in his hand. He wore formal leathers trimmed with black direwolf fur, looking every inch the brutal warlord his father had been. To his right sat Frederick Hastings, his beta. Frederick looked sharp, his graying hair pulled back perfectly, a silver pin shaped like the Highridge crest gleaming on his lapel. Across from them sat Lady Rowena and her uncle, Lord Reginald de Store. Reginald was a wealthy, dangerous man who controlled the iron mines of the western ridges. He was the architect of Rowena's ascent, a man who viewed people as nothing more than numbers on a ledger. Rowena sat beside him, wearing a dress of sheer crimson silk that left little to the imagination. She smiled at Alistair, a predatory, victorious smirk. "The preparations for the feast are flawless, sire," Frederick said smoothly, sliding a heavy parchment across the table. "The delegations are eager. All that remains is the formal signing of the courtship contract between Highridge and the House of Astor, a union that will bring unprecedented security to our borders." Alistair stared at the parchment. He could smell the arrogance rolling off Frederick in waves. It made him want to shift right there and tear his beta's throat out. He thought of Clara lying in his bed, bearing the horrific scars this man had ignored for a piece of land. "Security," Alistair mused, swirling the wine in his cup. "A vital thing, but a courtship is a delicate matter, Lord Astor. I have many allies to consider." Reginald's eyes narrowed slightly. "With respect, King Alistair, the Western armies are not an alliance one keeps waiting. My niece has been more than patient. Your father all but promised this union." "My father is dead," Alistair replied softly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "But you are right. It is time I chose a Luna. The pack needs stability. I will make my official announcement tonight at the climax of the feast before all the delegations." Rowena's smile widened, her eyes gleaming with triumph. She leaned forward, placing a manicured hand over Alistair's on the table. "You will not regret it, my king. I will make Highridge greater than it has ever been." Alistair didn't pull his hand away, though it took every ounce of his supernatural restraint not to break her fingers. "I am sure you will get exactly what you deserve, Rowena." The council adjourned an hour later. As the nobles filed out, Alistair caught the eye of his vanguard captain, Gideon, a massive brute of a man with a scarred face, fiercely loyal only to the Alpha line. Alistair gave him a nearly imperceptible nod. Gideon peeled away from the shadows. The trap was set. Back in the royal chambers, Clara stood before a full-length silver mirror. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Cavendish's treatments, combined with the awakening of her dormant wolf and the proximity of her mate, had triggered a rapid healing response. She was still painfully thin, and the thick, raised scars on her back would never fully fade. But the angry red inflammation was gone. More importantly, the dead, hollow look in her eyes had been replaced by a fierce, burning amber spark. Her wolf was awake, and it was furious. She was dressed in a gown Alistair had secretly procured from the royal vaults. It was a masterpiece of midnight blue velvet, entirely backless. It was a deliberate, terrifying choice. The deep V of the dress swept down to her waist, framing the horrific, jagged scars and the unmistakable burned brand of the Astor house for all the world to see. Long sleeves of sheer starry lace covered her arms, and a delicate silver chain rested against her collarbone. She looked like a shattered porcelain doll glued back together with dark magic and pure vengeance. The door opened, and Alistair stepped in. He stopped dead, his breath catching in his throat at the sight of her. The sheer presence she commanded, even with her visible trauma, was awe-inspiring. "You are beautiful," he murmured, walking up behind her. He didn't touch the scars, but he leaned in, his chest brushing the velvet of her dress, and met her eyes in the mirror. Clara swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the fabric of her skirt. "I am terrified, Alistair. My father, when he sees me, when he sees you, he will know his doom has arrived," Alistair said, his voice a low, comforting rumble in her ear. "You have hidden in the ashes for 3 years, Clara. Tonight, you are going to walk into that hall not as a victim, but as a survivor, as my mate, as their queen. Rowena's guards will be heavily armed. The Astor family travels with mercenaries. My vanguard has already quietly relieved them of their posts," Alistair stated, a cruel smirk touching his lips. "Gideon has sealed the outer gates. No one leaves the Great Hall tonight until I say so. The feast is a locked cage, and they have willingly walked inside." Clara took a deep breath, the scent of her mate grounding her, giving her the strength she needed. She closed her eyes, reaching deep into her soul, feeling the heavy, powerful presence of her wolf pacing behind her ribs, eager to be unleashed. "Are you ready?" Alistair asked, extending his arm to her. Clara opened her eyes. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, crystalline resolve. She looked at the scars in the mirror one last time, the map of her suffering, the proof of their treason. "Take me to the feast," Clara commanded, slipping her hand through his arm. "It is time to serve the main course." The Great Hall of Highridge was a masterpiece of medieval excess, a cavernous space of dark stone and soaring archways, illuminated by hundreds of floating tallow candles. The air was thick with the scent of roasted venison, honeyed root vegetables, and heavily spiced wine. Dozens of long oak tables were packed with visiting dignitaries, allied Alpha delegates, and the highest-ranking members of the Highridge pack. The noise was deafening, a chaotic symphony of clinking goblets, boisterous laughter, and the subtle, sharp undertones of political maneuvering. At the head of the room sat the high table, elevated on a stone dais. Frederick Hastings sat near the king's empty chair, nursing a cup of wine, his chest puffed with pride. He looked every inch the distinguished Beta, secure in his power and his newly acquired lands. A few seats away, Lady Rowena and her uncle, Lord Reginald Astor, held court. Rowena was radiant in her crimson silk, a confident, predatory smile painted on her lips as she accepted the premature congratulations of the lesser lords. She had already mentally measured the royal chambers for new drapes. Suddenly, the heavy iron-wrought doors at the far end of the hall swung open with a resounding crash that rattled the nearest goblets. The laughter died instantly. The musicians in the gallery faltered, their lutes and fiddles squeaking to a halt. The silence that swept through the great hall was absolute and suffocating, heralded by a sudden, terrifying drop in the room's atmospheric pressure. Alpha King Halaster strode into the hall. He wore no crown, but he needed none. He was dressed in formal pitch-black leathers trimmed with silver, his heavy direwolf cloak billowing behind him. His eyes, usually a cool, guarded brown, were entirely swallowed by a luminescent predatory amber. The sheer force of his alpha aura rolled off him in suffocating waves, heavy with the scent of ozone and impending violence. Weaker wolves in the hall instinctively lowered their heads, baring their throats in submission as he passed. Alistair did not go to his chair. He stopped in the center of the room, standing at the base of the dais, his gaze sweeping over the sea of faces until it locked onto the Astor delegation. "My lords, my pack." Alistair's voice boomed, completely devoid of its usual diplomatic warmth. It was the voice of a warlord standing on a battlefield. "Tonight we gather to celebrate my naming day, but more importantly, we gather to witness a choice. You have all waited patiently for me to select a Luna to stand beside me and guide Highridge into a new era." Rowena stood up, smoothing the front of her crimson gown, her smile blinding. She took a step forward, ready to descend the dais and take his hand. Lord Reginald nodded approvingly, raising his goblet in a silent toast. Alistair didn't even look at her. He turned his body slightly back toward the open doors. "I did not have to look far," Alistair continued, his voice dropping to a low, reverent timbre that echoed perfectly in the silent hall. "Because the goddess had already chosen for me. She was stolen. She was hidden, but she has returned." He extended his hand toward the darkness of the corridor. From the shadows, Clara emerged. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. She was a vision in midnight blue velvet, the fabric clinging to her slender frame before cascading into a pool of dark starlight at her feet. Her hair, washed free of the kitchen's grease and soot, tumbled down her shoulders in soft, shining waves. But it was her eyes that held the room captive. They were glowing with the fierce, undeniable amber fire of an awakened wolf. Frederick Hastings dropped his silver goblet. It hit the stone floor with a sharp, ringing clatter, spilling blood-red wine across the dais. His face, drained of all color, turned the shade of old parchment. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white as he stared at the daughter he had thrown into the dark. "Clara," Frederick whispered, the word barely escaping his throat, sounding like a dying man's rattle. Whispers erupted like wildfire. The Beta's daughter, the crippled girl, the scullery maid. Rowena froze, her confident smile shattering into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice shrill, the aristocratic veneer slipping. "Alistair, this is a sick joke. She is a broken thing, a madwoman from the kitchens." Alistair ignored her. He kept his eyes entirely on Clara as she walked gracefully down the center aisle. She didn't look at the crowd. She kept her chin high, her hands steady as she reached the Alpha King. Alistair took her hand, bringing her knuckles to his lips in a gesture of profound, undeniable respect, kissing her before the entire kingdom. "She is Clara Hastings," Alistair announced, intertwining his fingers with hers. "And she is my fated mate." Pandemonium broke out. Chairs scraped against stone as lords and ladies stood, shouting questions, demanding explanations. A fated mate overruled any political contract, any alliance. It was the absolute law of the goddess. Alistair raised a single hand, and the room snapped back to terrified silence. "But my mate has suffered a grave injustice," Alistair said, his voice turning deadly cold. He stepped to the side, gently turning Clara by the shoulders so her back faced the high table and the majority of the room. The backless design of the midnight blue gown performed its terrifying duty. Under the bright glare of the hundreds of candles, the horrific landscape of Clara's back was laid bare. The gasps this time were not of surprise, but of horror. Some of the softer-stomached nobles turned away, covering their mouths. The thick, jagged ravines of scar tissue, still pink and sensitive from Cavendish's chemical extractions, told a story of prolonged, unimaginable torture. And there, dead center between her shoulder blades, was the undeniable burned-in symbol, the stylized wolf head crowned with thorns, the crest of the Astor family. "By the goddess." An older alpha from the northern peaks swore aloud, making the sign of the moon over his chest. "That is silver burn. Rogues did not do this," Alistair roared, his voice finally breaking free from its restraints, shaking the very dust from the rafters. Rogues do not forge branding irons with the crest of their victims' political rivals. This was a calculated, orchestrated mutilation, a treason committed against the crown, against my mate, and against the laws of our kind. This is slander, Lord Reginald Astor bellowed, slamming his fists on the table, though a bead of sweat had broken out on his forehead. You dare accuse the House of Astor of this barbarism based on a scar that could have been forged by any cutthroat with a piece of hot iron. This girl is a liar, trying to steal a crown she does not deserve. Is she? A new voice cut through the tension. From the side door of the hall, Dr. Henry Cavendish stepped forward, flanked by two heavily armed royal guards. He carried his thick leather medical ledger and a clear glass vial containing a swirling black metallic liquid. I am Dr. Henry Cavendish, royal physician and alchemist, he announced, his clinical tone slicing through the emotional hysteria of the room. He held up the vial. This was extracted from the Lady Clara's spine mere hours ago. It is a highly specialized alloy of silver, white phosphorus, and concentrated wolfsbane. It is not a street weapon. It is a chemical paralytic designed to keep a wolf dormant while inducing maximum agony. He turned to look dead at Reginald. An alchemical signature to the Astor Syndicate's black market armories. Reginald's face flushed a dangerous, violent red. You take the word of a human pill pusher over your greatest ally. My guards will not stand for this insult. Reginald raised his hand, two fingers extended, the silent signal for his heavily armed mercenaries stationed at the perimeter of the hall to draw their steel. Nothing happened. Reginald looked around frantically. Where his men had stood in their polished armor, there were only the hulking, shadow-draped figures of Alistair's vanguard. Captain Gideon stepped out from behind a massive stone pillar, wiping a speck of blood from his cheek. He tossed a handful of silver Astor insignias onto the floor. They clattered loudly in the silence. Our men are currently enjoying the hospitality of our subterranean holding cells, Lord Astor. Gideon rumbled, resting his hand on the hilt of his broadsword. The gates are sealed, the perimeter is secured, no one leaves. Rowena panicked. She scrambled backward, knocking over her chair, her eyes darting like a trapped rat's. Alistair, please, I knew nothing of this. My uncle, he managed the guards. He orchestrated the ambush. I only wanted to love you. You do not know the meaning of the word. Alistair snarled, stepping up onto the dais, his presence forcing Rowena to cower against the stone wall. He turned his blazing eyes to the man who had sat at his right hand for 3 years. Frederick Hastings was trembling violently. He couldn't look at Alistair. He couldn't look at the hall. He could only stare at his daughter. Clara stepped up onto the dais. She didn't hide behind her alpha. She walked directly toward her father, the man who had taught her how to track, how to read the stars, how to be a proud wolf of Highridge. Clara, Frederick whimpered, tears finally spilling from his eyes. Clara, please understand. When I found you in the woods, you were broken. The healers said you would never shift again. We would have lost everything, our standing, our power. Lord Astor offered the Eastern Valleys. I did it to secure the Hastings legacy. I did it for the pack. You did it for yourself. Clara said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a razor-sharp edge of absolute finality. The lingering affection she had held for him, the desperate childhood hope that he had somehow made a mistake, evaporated like water on a hot iron. You found me bleeding, chained to a tree, begging for my father to save me. And instead of a father, I found a coward who sold his daughter's soul for a patch of dirt. She leaned in closer, her amber eyes burning into his. Wolf was never dead, father. She was just waiting for a real alpha to wake her up. Frederick collapsed to his knees, burying his face in his hands, sobbing openly in front of the entire assembly. The ultimate disgrace. Alistair stepped beside Clara, wrapping an arm securely around her waist, claiming her before the world. He looked out over the stunned, silent hall. Frederick Hastings, Alistair pronounced, his voice echoing with the absolute authority of the king. I strip you of your title as Beta. I strip you of your lands, your wealth, and your name. You are banished from the northern territories. If you are found within my borders by sunrise, you will be hunted down and killed as a rogue. Frederick wailed, but 2 vanguard guards hauled him roughly to his feet and dragged him toward the side doors. He didn't fight them. He was already a ghost. As for the House of Astor, Alistair continued, turning his lethal gaze upon Reginald and Rowena. You plotted against the crown. You tortured an innocent. You attempted to usurp the royal bloodline through deceit and dark alchemy. You cannot do this, Reginald spat as Gideon clamped heavy iron shackles around his wrists. The western armies will march on Highridge. We will burn you to the ground. Let them march, Alistair said softly, a terrifying, bloodthirsty smile curving his lips. I have been looking for an excuse to expand my borders westward. And now, I have the absolute moral authority to slaughter every last soldier who wears your crest. Rowena screamed, thrashing wildly as she was shackled and dragged away, her crimson silk tearing on the stone floor. Alistair, I am your equal. She is nothing. She is a maid. Her voice faded down the corridor, locked away in the dark. The great hall was left in stunned, breathless silence. The power dynamic of the entire kingdom had shifted in a matter of minutes. Treason had been rooted out, and a brutal, undeniable justice had been served. Alistair turned to Clara. The cold warlord mask melted away, leaving only the devoted mate. He gently touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a single stray tear that had managed to escape. He took her hand and led her to the center of the high table. There were 2 ornate chairs carved from ancient ironwood. He did not sit in the king's chair. Instead, he pulled out the second chair, the one that had remained empty for 3 years. "To my Luna," Alistair said, raising a fresh goblet of wine. The hall erupted. It started with the vanguard, stamping the butts of their spears against the stone floor in a rhythmic, deafening beat of approval. The allied alphas followed suit, raising their goblets, their voices joining together in a resounding roar that shook the very foundations of Hyrage. "To the Luna, to the Queen." Clara looked out over the sea of cheering faces, the heat of the fire warming her back, the scent of her mate enveloping her senses. The scullery maid was dead. The ashes had blown away. And from them, the Queen of Hyrage had finally risen. The euphoric cheers of the great hall had barely faded into the tapestries when the heavy, mournful bellow of the western watchtower horn shattered the night. The sound was a visceral punch to the gut, a desperate warning that cut through the lingering warmth of the feast. Lord Reginald's threat of retaliation was not a future promise. It was an immediate, terrifying reality. The Astor Syndicate had not just traveled with a ceremonial guard. A massive, hidden strike force, led by Rowena's ruthless older brother, General Nathaniel Astor, had been camped in the jagged ravines of the Whispering Pines, waiting for the signal that Alistair had been assassinated or overthrown. When Reginald's silver insignias were stripped and the gates locked, a solitary Astor scout had managed to slip a flare through the iron grates of the crypts. Now, the Western Army was at the gates of Hyrage. "They are using the blizzard as cover," Captain Gideon roared, bursting back into the great hall, his ceremonial leathers already swapped for heavy, battle-scarred iron plating. "A force of at least 2,000, sire. They have silver-tipped ballistas and grappling hooks. They are trying to scale the Weeping Wall." Alistair's jaw locked. The Alpha King's eyes burned with a terrifying, unyielding light. He turned to Clara, his hands gripping her shoulders. "I need you to go to the inner keep with Dr. Cavendish. It is lined with lead and reinforced oak. You will be safe there." "I am your Luna," Clara argued fiercely, the amber fire in her own eyes flaring. The chemical suppressants were gone, and her wolf was screaming for blood, demanding to protect her pack. "I belong at your side. Hyrage is my home as much as yours." "And you are still healing, Clara," Alistair said, his voice dropping into a desperate, pleading register that only she could hear. He pressed his forehead against hers. "If I lose you tonight, after just finding you, my wolf will tear this world apart and me along with it. Please, command the reserves from the keep. Keep my people safe from the inside." Reluctantly, Clara nodded. She watched her mate turn, his bones cracking and shifting with sickening, glorious violence as he sprinted toward the courtyard. By the time Alistair hit the freezing air, he had fully shifted into a massive, midnight black direwolf, leading the vanguard into the teeth of the storm. Clara, escorted by Dr. Cavendish and a small contingent of royal guards, hurried through the freezing, torchlit corridors toward the inner keep. But as they passed the lower armory, Clara's heightened, newly awakened senses caught a scent that made her blood run cold. It was the smell of lamp oil, sulfur, and burning parchment. "Stop," Clara commanded, holding up her hand. She turned toward the dark, narrow stairwell leading to the postern gate, the vulnerable, hidden exit used only by servants and smugglers. "Someone is down there." "My lady, we must proceed to the keep," one of the guards urged, his hand on his sword. "I said stop," Clara growled. Her voice resonated with a sudden, authoritative alpha pitch that forced the guard to instantly bare his throat in submission. She moved silently down the stairwell, her velvet gown sweeping over the stone. At the bottom of the stairs, standing by the heavy iron mechanisms of the postern gate, was Jonathan Sterling, the head steward, the man who had sneered at her in the kitchens for 3 years. He was frantically pouring lamp oil over the thick wooden locking beams, a lit torch trembling in his other hand. Outside the heavy timber door, Clara could hear the muffled, chaotic shouts of Astor mercenaries waiting for the breach. "Sterling!" Clara's voice cracked like a whip in the confined space. The steward spun around, dropping the oil flask. His face was pale, his eyes wide with panic. Lady Clara, I was securing the gate. The mechanisms were frozen." "You were trying to burn the locking beams," Clara said, her eyes narrowing as she pieced the puzzle together. The real-life betrayals of the pack ran deeper than her father. "Lord Reginald paid you, didn't he? To let the assassins in from the rear while the king is distracted at the front." Sterling drew a jagged, silver-coated dagger from his belt. The trembling in his hand stopped, replaced by a desperate, cornered malice. "The Astor Syndicate pays in solid gold, Clara. Alistair pays in speeches about honor. This castle is going to fall tonight. I will not die with it." He lunged at her. The royal guards behind Clara shouted, rushing forward, but the corridor was too narrow. Sterling was fast, his silver dagger aimed directly at Clara's chest. In that fraction of a second, the years of suppression, the agony of the silver burns, and the rage of a stolen life crystallized within Clara's soul. The chemical chains Cavendish had weakened finally shattered completely. Clara didn't scream. She roared. The transformation was explosive. The exquisite midnight blue gown tore into shreds as Clara's body expanded, her bones realigning with a deafening crackle that echoed off the stone walls. The pain of the shift was excruciating, her muscles remembering the trauma of the silver, but the ecstasy of freedom was infinitely stronger. Sterling stumbled back, dropping his torch, his eyes wide with absolute terror. Where the fragile, scarred scullery maid had stood, a magnificent beast now loomed. Clara's wolf was enormous, nearly the size of Alistair's, but her coat was a blinding, iridescent white, glowing with an ethereal, almost spectral light in the dim corridor. The silver burns on her human back had translated into striking, jagged silver stripes across her white fur, a permanent mark of her survival, a crown of scars. With a terrifying snarl, Clara lunged. She didn't bite him. She simply slammed her massive paws into Sterling's chest, throwing him backward with the force of a battering ram. He slammed into the stone wall, the silver dagger clattering harmlessly to the floor, knocked entirely unconscious before he even hit the ground. Secure the gate. Extinguish the oil. Clara barked, her voice projecting through her wolf form directly into the minds of the royal guards via the pack link. The guards, awestruck by the sheer, dominating presence of their new Luna, scrambled to obey. But Clara wasn't finished. Through the mate bond, a golden, pulsating thread in her mind, she felt a sudden, sharp spike of agony. It was Alistair. Without hesitating, the white wolf turned and bolted up the stairs, moving with a fluid, terrifying grace. She tore through the castle corridors, a blur of white lightning, leaving Dr. Cavendish and the guards far behind. She burst through the main, heavy oak doors and out into the blizzard-swept courtyard. The scene was pure chaos. Fire and blood stained the pristine northern snow. Hyridge's vanguard was holding the line, but the Astor mercenaries were armed with silver-laced nets and spears. In the center of the carnage, Alistair was surrounded. He was bleeding from several shallow silver cuts. His massive black wolf form cornered by General Nathaniel Astor and 6 heavily armed mercenaries holding silver-tipped pikes. Nathaniel, a hulking brute in thick armor, held a heavy crossbow loaded with a solid silver bolt aimed directly at Alistair's heart. "The king is dead," Nathaniel roared to his men, his finger tightening on the trigger. A deafening, earth-shattering howl ripped through the courtyard, freezing every man and wolf in their tracks. From the high stone steps of the keep, Clara launched herself into the air. The blizzard seemed to part around her, the moonlight catching the silver scars embedded in her pristine white coat. She descended upon the Astor mercenaries like an avenging angel of death. She landed squarely on Nathaniel Astor, her jaws clamping down on the thick iron plating of his shoulder armor, crushing it like tin. The crossbow fired wildly into the snow. Alistair, fueled by the arrival of his mate, erupted with renewed, terrifying vigor. The black direwolf tore through the remaining pikemen, his massive jaws making short work of their wooden hafts and armor. Clara tossed Nathaniel aside, placing one massive white paw heavily on his chest, her amber eyes burning down into his terrified face. She bared her teeth, a low, guttural growl vibrating through the very earth. The message was clear. Move and you die. Seeing their general pinned by the legendary White Wolf and the Alpha King standing completely unharmed beside her, the remaining Astor mercenaries broke. Weapons clattered to the cobblestones as men fell to their knees, raising their hands in surrender. The siege of Hyridge was broken before it could truly begin. Alistair shifted back to his human form, ignoring the biting cold and his bleeding wounds. He walked over to Clara. Slowly, gracefully, the massive white wolf bowed her head, her form shrinking and reforming until Clara stood before him, shivering in the freezing snow, wearing nothing but the shredded remnants of her velvet gown. Alistair immediately stripped off his heavy direwolf cloak and wrapped it securely around her, pulling her flush against his chest. He buried his face in her neck, breathing in the scent of rainwater, crushed orchids, and the sharp, metallic tang of victory. "You didn't stay in the keep," Alistair murmured, a mixture of exasperation and overwhelming awe in his voice. "You said you needed a Luna to guide Hyridge into a new era." Clara whispered back, her arms wrapping tightly around his waist, resting her hands against the hard muscles of his back. She looked over the courtyard at the bowing vanguard and the defeated enemies. "I thought it was time to start leading." Alistair pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. He saw the fire, the strength, and the unyielding spirit of the woman who had survived the dark and climbed back into the light. He kissed her deep and fiercely, sealing their bond beneath the bruised, snow-filled sky. The scars on her back would never fade. They would forever be a testament to the cruelty of the world. But as the first rays of dawn broke over the frosted and peaks of Highridge, painting the blood-stained snow in hues of gold and pink, Clara knew she would never hide them again. She was the White Wolf of Highridge, and she was finally home. Wow, what an incredible journey of betrayal, survival, and ultimate revenge. Clara's transformation from a broken scullery, maid to the fiercely powerful White Wolf of Highridge, proves that true strength can never be permanently silenced. Did you expect that massive twist with the castle steward? Let us know in the comments below what your favorite moment was, and if you think Lord Reginald got the punishment he deserved. If you love this medieval werewolf romance as much as we love telling it, please smash that like button and share this video with your fellow fantasy lovers. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our thrilling, heart-pounding stories. Until next time, stay wild.